This is On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. A hellscape climate future is just one of the many science stories in the news. Vaccine skepticism is back with a potential presidential candidate, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., questioning the legitimacy of medicine. Conspiracy theories, online misinformation, and science denialism are drawing the public's attention, while data charts and risk assessments are relegated to obscure scientific journals. Is it all really a question of messaging? How we tell people something's up through scientific reasoning? And appeals to our naked self-interest? Pleas to our rationality haven't broken through, and a lack of trust may be a factor in that. According to the Pew Research Center, almost 1 in 3 Americans say they have a great deal of confidence in scientists to act in the public's best interest. Christopher Reddy is a scientist who's watched in despair as public confidence in science has plummeted, and he argues his profession is part of the problem. He's a senior scientist at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and after the 2010 Deepwater Horizon spill in the Gulf of Mexico, his research focused on crisis management for climate disaster. In his new book, Science Communication in a Crisis, Reddy grapples with communicating about climate change and other potential human disasters, and he has prescriptions for breaking through misinformation and skepticism. Christopher Reddy, welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Thanks so much for having me, Ray. Real pleasure.
Science communication in a crisis would get a knowing nod from some people, but an eye roll from others. How has your experience in natural disasters and oil spills prepared you to write this book?
Crisis is a crisis. It is an unfortunate event, and more often than not, folks want answers sooner than later, and they want them with much greater certainty than most scientists are comfortable stating. The scale of impact is significant, but at the end of the day, it's an unfortunate, untimed event. It's an opportunity where folks from a variety of different backgrounds and interests and cultures are in an intersection of interests, and people want answers. And the more importantly, too, is, like it or not, this is not some TV show. There's no happy ending. It's really just a mindset of trying to make a bad thing from getting worse.
So something's happening somewhere in the planet. As is so often the case, a radio show or a television news set or a newspaper article attempts to answer public questions and sometimes to allay public fears. What are some of the mistakes experts are making when trying to communicate to the public not only what's happening, but what they have to be concerned about?
Well, I think a lot of times we worry too much about what our colleagues think of us. And so in reality, while we might be getting interviewed by you, Ray, and your audience, we actually treat you, and we're thinking about our audience of peers. And so we speak worried about how we're going to be critiqued by our peers instead of looking at it as an opportunity to inform you and your audience. Let me explain. For the most part, we worry that we're going to look sloppy. So we always start with all the things we don't know and all the little nuances, because we don't want to say, oh, you gotcha, right? Where in reality, a scientist should go on there and say, hey, this is what we know right now. This is what we don't know. This is what's changing. This is what's under debate. And actually give people a little bit of a forecast. Like, hey, listen, based on past events, this is what's going to play out. Science is going to move fast. This is what we certainly know. A lot of times you also can say, well, this is certainly not, for example, there was a train rail derailment recently, and some guy said that it was Chernobyl. And that was poor form because it wasn't Chernobyl. So you have opportunities to inform, but more often than not, we miss the boat by going into the nuance and the heavy details too early instead of just really upfront giving something to satiate and nourish your audience.
Well, for years, I've been on the other side of that transaction. And I understand why scientists, why experts in various fields want to lay out the things they don't know as well as the things they do. I get it. But so often, and we're there to behave as proxies for the audience, we're left nowhere. We're so loaded up with, well, could be this, could be that. On the other hand, well, you should keep this in mind. And at the end of the interview, I think, I haven't really told my audience what they need to know, what they should conclude about this thing.
Which then is a net negative for science. Scientists gets people interested and they want to listen and they want to learn. And when they walk away without being informed by a scientist, they get the vibe that there isn't any knowledge. And when you don't have that, you have increased amounts of uncertainty and concern. And that is the breeding ground for misinformation.
Here's where we run into the problem. Science itself, the conclusions made by using the scientific method aren't good or bad. They just are. Reality doesn't get to be put to a vote. It just is. But what's real is not subject to sentiment, but what people are prepared to believe is subject to sentiment. If they come to the conversation already, let's say, inclined to believe that climate change is not happening, if they come to the transaction already inclined to believe that there's something they're not being told about the COVID-19 vaccine, they will have a predisposition not to believe what they're hearing. Does the expert source have to take that into account when they are communicating, whether in crisis times or when the house is not on fire?
Absolutely. I mean, this is a hard thing. And I'm not a behaviorist, but what I will tell you to start off is that if you have somebody on the fence or maybe pushing back a little, the last thing you want to do is whip out some Excel charts and PowerPoint decks. I mean, that's not how you're going to win over somebody with small little dots and can't you see this? And your fingers running over the graph so they can't even see it. And you're starting to go into the nuances. So more often than not, I think when you walk into those situations, you want to listen and you want to find some common ground and you want to get a source of where they're coming from and maybe find a way to communicate in a way that connects with them. That takes a lot of time, but it's got a better chance of a positive than saying, don't you know? And then, what's the worst thing is that when they get a little bit of pushback and you get really frustrated, that's when you drop your resume. Do you understand? I went to Harvard and got my PhD at MIT. I postdoced at Stanford, and my postdoc advisor won the Nobel for blah, 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 blah. Some folks just don't even understand what a postdoc is or any of this stuff. And that's even worse. So again, a lot of these interactions were just a great opportunity to inform or maybe just to have an appreciation about what your audience is. And instead you walk away as a net negative. And, those are missed opportunities that we just want to avoid.
Has the ground we're standing on changed in recent years? It seems to me like it wasn't always like this, that people who were not educated in a particular field were more ready, let's say, to give an ear to people who are speaking with authority on a topic than they are now.
Yeah, and I think some of that stems back to time and certainty. And I tend to think that Steve Jobs is a little to blame.
Steve Jobs? How so?
Well, tongue in cheek there. But at the end of the day, we have programmed people and gotten used to the fact that if somebody asks a question, you whip out your phone, you Google it, and 3 seconds later, you have this answer, which you assume is absolutely correct. And you're nourished. So suddenly you get programmed for that. And then so you start asking, what's the efficacy of this vaccine or something? And it's not so easy to go through a peer-reviewed paper and see how many sample size it was and what was the controls and all these things. And the end result is it's frustrating. I'm not being an apologist for science. I think it's great that science is slow. I think that it's great that science lives in a world of uncertainty. I mean, I'm a scientist because I like uncertainty, but we do have to communicate to the public that just because science doesn't answer your 4-second Wikipedia with absolute certainty doesn't mean it's wrong.
Okay, let's stipulate then, for the purposes of this conversation, that uncertainty is good, that people want to know more, but their doubt of everything they see starts to be sort of corrosive. You can't learn anything or understand anything, synthesize, when you are inclined to disbelieve everything you hear. And into that weird vacuum created by that moment, are the millions of people who tell opinion researchers that, yes, they believe 5G towers can control human beings, that there are chips in vaccines, that your body has been altered by new style vaccines, and that makes you more susceptible to control by electronic means. I mean, some of this stuff is just goofy. And yet, people are comfortable with disbelieving people who've spent their whole life working on these things. And they're inclined to believe somebody who tells them something that's just loopy.
This is starting to get outside my pay grade and knowledge base, but I think Al Gore was onto something more than just climate change. Often this stems back from an inconvenience. I think a lot of folks push back because it's inconvenient or they don't want to think about it, or maybe it pushes back on fear. But I do think that when I talk to people about science and they push back, they often it'll come back to maybe their wallet or their palate or how their family life is or their own concern and love. So I think a lot of these folks who do embrace it, they're not bad people. And I don't think that they're, let's say, not smart. I think for whatever reason, they're in this pathway and we just got to figure out a better way to close some of these paths that aren't well grounded in science and get them in a way that's, recognize that at the end of the day, science has a tremendous track record in improving lives and livelihoods and society. Even these folks who are pushing back on one topic of science are bathed in the wonderfulness of so many other things that science has yielded. So we're just got to kind of figure this out. And I think conversations are a really good step.
Given what you just said, at the same time, confidence in science and scientists is at a low. It's in a trough. How do we get out of there?
Well, I mean, first of all, the pandemic was such an unbelievable outlier. From a science perspective, there's going to be zillions of PhDs being written on this. So, but I think that the pandemic, the current political ideals, and also, even the speed of the internet and how small the world is, created an unfortunate bomb of anti-science. And, I don't have a lot of solutions, but I do believe that we are in a place where we have anything but up in a lot of places. And we just have to refocus on the fact that people got frustrated during the pandemic, but their frustrations on science were not because of the science. It was more on the inconvenience and the fear. So, yeah, science is at a low point. I think that we keep doing better. We keep listening, but we also have to recognize, not be too hard on ourselves, that the pandemic created a lot of chaos for a lot of fields.
But if you want to start not only yourself, but start the profession on the road back to public credibility, among that big portion of the public that you seem to have lost, what are some of the basic building blocks of doing that? What do you have to do?
Well, I think now, historically, folks would say, well, scientists have to be better, communicate better. They're not doing, you're out of their element. They're last pick in gym class. They forget their car keys and all these things. And at the end of the day, yeah, I think scientists can do a better job. But we also have to have a better job of informing, policymakers and the media and other folks about how science works. It's so easy to point the fingers at scientists. But if you want a well-informed public, other folks have to be willing to explain and kind of highlight that this is how science works. It's not just the scientists. It's on the backs of media and other policy people to actually explain how science works and do so effectively, so that it helps get people over these humps.
I'll agree that the media needs to do a better job. The unfortunate part of scientists needing the media to do a better job is that they're among the least trusted professionals in 2023 as well. It's like being thrown overboard in a storm, and the person who can save you also can't swim. It's a weird thing to have media be your partner when things are in the state they're in right now with such low public trust.
Yeah, and the irony is, I think that scientists and the media are a lot closer than people think. I think that the media gravitates to people who are inherently curious and hungry and thirsty for answers and like to talk about it to an audience about what they've learned. And so while we might be two groups stuck in a lifeboat, there's a tremendous amount of synergy and capacity for us to both overwhelm both of our ills. Connected, we might be able to overcome both of our challenges.
We are talking at a time when every couple of days it's in the news that the planet has broken another temperature record. Now, throughout my career in the news business, I've had people tell me, smart people, authoritative people, that once the proof is laid bare for everybody to see, once people are experiencing outlier phenomena themselves, then public sentiment will begin to change. But that doesn't seem to be what's happening, at least not right away. People are baking, not just in faraway parts of the world where we don't know anybody, but in Phoenix and Houston and very familiar and very accessible places with lots of people. People will die in their apartments. People will pass out walking down the sidewalk. And yet there's a real resistance to taking on board the alterations human beings might be making to the way the systems that govern the planet work.
Yeah, there's a lot going on there. Ray, I think that if carbon dioxide was black and folks saw the increasing amounts of our atmosphere getting grayer and grayer every day, I think the visual component of pollution is very gravitating to people. Unfortunately, carbon dioxide is invisible and you can't smell it and you can't taste it. It's also 400 parts per million does not seem like a lot. So, yeah, I mean, first thing is that carbon dioxide, in trying to explain to people that, it's hard to grab your head around. People talk about 2 degrees, 2 degrees this and 2 degrees that. Now that's in Celsius, which inherently has some challenges switching back to Fahrenheit. But last night we have an air conditioner in my living room. And for whatever reason, it was turned on. And I knew I was going to speak to you today. And I said, I wonder what the temperature of this room is. And I guessed, I knew a little bit inside knowledge that my wife likes it really cold. And so I said, you know what? I think it's probably 68, right? And it was somehow or another 65. But the point of the matter is, I'm a well-informed guy. I had a sense it was cold. I felt it's cold. And, I'm a scientist. I have indicators. I'm looking for condensation on this glass, all these things. And I was off by 3 degrees. And I couldn't tell the difference enough. And so now you're trying to inform a public that a 2-degree shift is meaningful. But I couldn't even figure it out myself. The point of the matter is that it's hard for folks to wrap their heads around the idea that carbon dioxide is the culprit when it's invisible and at 400 parts per million, and that slight changes in Celsius are hard to wrap your head around when you can't even figure out a slight change in predicting what isn't in Fahrenheit. So these are big challenges. And I think the biggest challenge I see a lot, and this is many other people talk about it, is the disconnect. There's really 2 questions going on. Is climate change happening? Is the world getting warmer, mostly from CO2 being created? Yes. I think that data is really hard, and hopefully folks are going to get onto that. But the problem is there's a cast of uncertainty put on that because it's hard to make the predictions, right? So it's easier and it's incredibly obvious that the world's getting warmer. But then that gets meshed into what's it going to be in 20 years. And that's when the uncertainty from scientists start to be put in because Mother Nature is a fickle beast. So the point of the matter is that we also have to start making a stronger argument about, is it real? Is this happening? And then make a very clear cut to say, this is what our predictions are. And they are much less certain than the tremendous amount of certainty we have about the dramatic change in our Earth's climate and temperature due to burning fossil fuels and other human activities.
Well, regardless of the science or the sentiment, if I had to design a problem from hell, I'd give it all the features of the climate change threat. I'd have the people most responsible for the problem suffer from it the least. I'd have the people most at risk very far away from the most responsible. I really worry about the gap, the enormous chasm between the people who are suffering the effects today and the people who feel like it will never touch them. I just don't know what the best road out of this is. And somehow you manage to be optimistic. Tell me how.
Well, and my motivation is as a, person of society, but I have 3 kids under 9, and I'm incredibly blessed for it. The reason why is I have great hope. Obviously not enough hope to tell people to keep driving their Humvees and things like that, or even in my case, have my living room at 66 degrees, although it was only for a short amount of time. I am starting to see the seeds of scientists and engineers who are a very competitive group and very smart. And when directed to solve a problem, can do things beyond belief. And I am seeing no longer these kind of cockamamie ideas to change the earth and things like that, but clever, meaningful, sustainable approaches about abating climate change that also benefits society and the economy. And so I think we're in the early stages, but there's a mindset of, yeah, we have a problem. And I think scientists and humans are good at solving problems when they're presented. And I see the problem solving coming online.
We've been talking about the decline in trust. We've been talking about the critical nature of some of the challenges we have. Are there venues to hold this conversation inside your crowd? Are people in your line of work already talking, maybe in a post-pandemic sense, about, whoa, that was a wake-up call. People really don't believe us. Are there conversations underway right now about how to dig yourself out of the hole that you're in?
First of all, I live in Cape Cod on Woods Hole. I am as far away from mainstream society on many days than other folks. And so I haven't gone to a lot of meetings and seen scientists like it was before the pandemic. So I believe that a lot of scientists are like a lot of other folks who are recognizing that grapes are $9 a pound and that it's hard to get a babysitter. And how am I going to get my research going back on and trying to get things going? And so, yeah, ideally, I'm not sure that folks are actually having that moment of broad reflection because we're trying to get our house back in order and trying to find some normalcy like everybody else. So I think that it would be really great for scientists to have a wake-up call and let them know about this. But on the flip side, there's a nuance here that I don't want scientists to become activists. A lot of scientists who think they need to be activists. And there's a time and a place for a very well-spoken scientist to maybe make that happen. But we don't want that. We want our scientists to keep their nose to the ground, learn about what we know, what we don't know, what's changing, what's under debate, find a way to get it communicated clearly in a way that it's meaningful and actionable. But I think that when you start to delve into the policy world, activism world, and, I've played that line a couple times, I think in reality it's a net negative.
Christopher Eddy, he's a senior scientist at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute and the author of Science Communication in a Crisis, an important read in 2023. Christopher Eddy, thanks for joining us on Shifting Ground.
It was a real pleasure, Ray. Real pleasure.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Elise Manukian, Sienna Barnes, and Andrew Stelzer. It was fact-checked by our intern, Adam Ailey. It was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Young is CEO of World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.